Tav Mem Aleph Amud Beis will begin Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, the Mishnah at the bottom. If you had a kettle that was on the fire and you remove the kettle, you are not allowed to put in cold water into it. You cannot put in cold water into that kettle to make it warm. But you could put liquid into that, or to a cup of warm water, to make it warm, lukewarm, but not hot. So the Gemara will discuss what the details of the Mishnah are, what in particular, what are we talking about. So we'll see that momentarily. But the underlying principle of the Mishnah is, and of the halachas of bishul, is that bishul, of course, can occur on something that's placed on the fire. And it can occur on a pot on the fire. But it can also occur in a kli rishon. Meaning, if you had a pot or if you had a kettle that was on the fire and it became hot as a result of the fire, now you removed it from the fire even though it's no longer on the fire. But if the contents that are placed into that pot or kettle will now become hot to the degree of yad lettuce blade, that your hand you'd move your hand back because it's so hot. Your hand would recoil from the heat. If it's to that degree, that temperature of yad lettuce blade, even if it's not on the fire, it's just in the kli rishon, the kli that was on the fire, there's bishul. But generally speaking, if it's a kli sheni, so for instance, you had a kettle that was on the fire, now you removed the contents poured that water into another cup, into a secondary cup. Generally speaking, there's no bishul in a kli sheni. Putting something into that secondary cup, there will be no bishul. So that's the underlying principle over here in the Mishnah. There is bishul in a kli rishon, not in a kli sheni, and bishul occurs if it reached the temperature of yad lettuce blade. So now the Gemara is going to explain the Mishnah. Maiko Amar, what does it mean, lo yitin? What does it mean, firstly, mechem shepineu? You remove the kettle. You remove kettle from what? What is removed? And what does it mean, lo yitin? And then it says, but noisen, but you could put into it. So Maiko Amar explains the Mishnah as follows. Pineu is referring to not only the kettle from the fire, but the contents of the kettle were removed. He poured out the water from the kettle. Now you have a kettle that's hot, that was heated from the fire, directly from the fire. It's removed from the fire, and the contents have been removed. You have a hot kettle. So you cannot put a small measure of water into that kettle in order to become hot. That will become bishul. If you put a small measure of water in the kettle, it'll become hot. If it becomes yad lettuce boy, it's now bishul because it became to the temperature of yad lettuce from a kli rishon. So that is awesome. But you could put aval noisen hu l'seich. When the Mishnah says aval noisen l'seich, it means you could put a large quantity of water over there, which will only make the water lukewarm, where it will not reach the temperature of yad lettuce boy. So therefore, even though it isn't a kli rishon, but it has not reached the level of yad lettuce boy, it's only lukewarm, so it's mutter. So you could put a l'man merum k'dei l'hafshir. How can you do that? Well, there's a secondary problem over here. If you're putting cold water into the hot kettle, the kettle that's been on the fire, and now you're putting cold water into it, so that tempers the steel. The metal becomes hardened. The way of tempering tempering steel is you first heat it to a high intensity of heat, and then you put cold water, you put it in cold water, and that hardens it. So even in terms of bishul, even if you say in terms of bishul, there's no bishul here because the water, you put in a large quantity of water, which does not become yad lettuce by. But in the process of doing this, you're putting the cold water into the hot kettle that was on the fire, you're hardening the metal. So that's mitzaref. That's makeh b'patish. That in itself is a malacha. So how can this be mutter? How can you do this? So more answers, Rav Shimon, because we say the Tana holds like Rav Shimon, who says that Davar Shem Miskaven is mutter, and so long as it's not a psik reisha, so long as it's not inevitable, then if that's not your intent is not for this malacha, it's mutter. So here also, his intent is to make the water lukewarm. He's not intending to be mitzaref the metal. And it's not a psik reisha either, because perhaps the metal is already hardened. Perhaps it's not heated up so much that the cold water will be mitzaref. So it's not a psik reisha, and that's not his intent. So the way he's learning now is that, therefore, that's not an issue, because we hold like Rav Shimon that a Davar Shem Miskaven is mutter. So therefore, the way Rav Ara bar Masla explains the Mishnah as follows: Hamechem shepinei, meaning you remove the kettle from the fire and you remove the contents of the kettle. Lo yiten l'seichet tzayin, you can't put in a small amount of cold water bishvil sheyachama, which will reach the level of yatzei lettuce boy, because that's bishul. Aval noisen hu l'seichai, but you could put into it what? You could put into it a large quantity of water which will not reach yatzei lettuce boy, which will only be lukewarm. Or l'seichai koyes k'dei la'afshirin. Or you could put it into a cup of warm water, which is a klisheni, and only to make it lukewarm. And in a koyes, there's no bishul regardless, because it's a klisheni. So oil koyes, and you could put in the because that's only considered in the koyes, which is a klisheni. That's only called lahafshirin regardless, because it's not considered chamim. It's not considered bishul. That's one approach. Abaye says the Tana should have clarified. He didn't say mecham shepine mimeno maim. He didn't say he emptied out the contents of the kettle. He said remove the kettle. If he meant to say that he removed the contents of the kettle, he should have said clearly shapina mimeno maim amayim. Now, Tosfos points out, even though the expression of shepineu could refer to contents, we have other examples where it does refer, this type of expression does refer to contents, but over here, the Tana, if that's what he meant, specifically that, he should have clarified that. And the fact that he didn't, Abaye says, therefore that's not the pshat in the Mishnah. What is the pshat in the Mishnah? He says as follows. If he puts a mecham shepineu v'yesh bo mayim chamin, he removed not the contents, he removed the kettle from the fire, and it still has the warm water. You cannot put in a little bit of water over there, because that will make it hot, and that'll be bishul. There's a kli rishon but you could put a large quantity which will only make it lukewarm. You can put a large quantity that will only make it lukewarm. And as the Chai Adam points out, that if it's only mutter if there's a large quantity, but not a small quantity, that means that that large quantity has to be poured in at one time. Because if he does it bit by bit, or if he does it gradually, then at each step, it's mayim water. And at each step, that water will become yatzei lettuce boy. So according to this, what it means is that he has to put the large quantity in at one time, so that no part of the water becomes yatzei lettuce boy. So that's one halacha. Umecham shepina mimenu mayim. And then the second part of the Mishnah is, now if you have a mecham that was removed, the contents were removed from them, lo yiten l'soycha mayim kol ikir. There you cannot put water at all in that, because that will be considered mitzaref. That's tempering, it's hardening the metal, as makid b'patish. Meaning, there's a chilik between the first part of the Mishnah and the second part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Hamecham shepinei, which Abaye learns what that means is not removing the contents. It's removing the kettle from the fire. Lo yiten l'seichet tzayin. You cannot put in cold water. You cannot put in a quantity of cold water that will reach yatzei lettuce boy. But you can put in a large quantity But you could put in a large quantity of a nice and hula soicha or soicha kais kadei lav shiran. You could put a large quantity of only to make it lukewarm. Now that's a mecham shepineo. But if it's a mecham shepinei memeno, if you remove the contents, now so that must be there's a different din if the contents are removed. If the contents were removed, then you can't put water at all over there. Now, what does it mean we can't put water at all? Meaning, if the contents were removed, you have another issue over here. If it's an empty kli, now you're putting in cold water, you have another issue. The other issue is mitzaref, that you're hardening it, you're tempering it, which is maki b'patish. So there, you can't put in, now there he says kol ikr, you can't put any amount of water. So what does that mean? Now, Rashi says that the amount of water that's required for metzaref, the amount of water is up to the brim. If it's not up to the brim, it won't harden the metal. The metal on top is very hard, is very hot rather, and then it has to be filled to the brim to take that metal and harden it. So according to that, it can't mean literally you can't put any amount of water. So the way the Rishonim speak out, the Ramban and the Ritva, the Rishonim speak out is, what it means is, but if you emptied out the contents of the kettle, you can't put water, kol ikr, it doesn't mean any amount of water. It means you can't put water even to any degree. Meaning even if you put in so much water that the result will be that the water is only lukewarm and not hot, that also is awesome. Now, if the contents, if the kettle has water in it, it already has water in it, so then putting in the cold water will not temper it. Because the result will be lukewarm water. That's not going to temper the metal. It's not going to harden the metal. So there's no problem over there being mitzaref. So over there is you can't put in water only if the temperature of the water will reach the level, the degree of Yatzalet boy. But if it will only be lukewarm, it's mutter. But if it's empty, if the kettle is empty out, if you remove the water, now it's an empty kettle. Now you have an issue of being mitzarev. There you cannot put in water, even if the result will be that the temperature of the water after you pour it in is only lukewarm, is only to make it lukewarm. It's not hot, it's not Yatzalet boy. It still will be also according to Baya, because if you fill it up with water, and even if the resultant temperature is only lukewarm, it's only lav shira, it's still also because you have a problem of being mitzaref, because you've been mitzaref. And as we'll see, Abaye holds like Rabbi Yehuda. Now, even though that's not your intent, and even though it's not inevitable, even though it's not a psikaresha, but he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, the davar shein miskaven is also. Yeah, so again, the Gemara says, Elo Amar Rabbi Achikam Mecham Shepineh V'yesh Bo Mayim Chaim Lo Yitel L'Soicha Mayim U'otim B'Shvil Sheicham Aval Nois L'Soicha Mayim Merubin K'dei Lo Avshir U'Mecham Shepineh Mimenu Mayim Lo Yitel L'Soicha Mayim Kol Ikim Neisha Mitzarev V'Rav Yehudi Domer Davar Shein Miskaven also Omer Rav Lo Yishon El L'Havshir. Rav says the heter is only to make it lukewarm. Aval L'Tzarev is also. But if you're going to be mitzaref it, to harden it, to temper it, it's also. Shmuel Amar afil mitzaref nami mutter, and Shmuel says even to be mitzaref, it's mutter to be mitzaref. What do you mean? The implication is mitzaref is mutter, mitzaref lecharchila mishori. The implication is it's mutter to be mitzaref, even lecharchila. Nobody says you can do it with the intent to be mitzaref. Even Rav Shimon says only davar shein miskaven, but you can't do it, put the water there with the intent to be mitzaref. Rav says you're only allowed to put in amount of water, that enough that will make the water lukewarm, but not the degree of water that you can't fill the kettle completely up to the brim. If you can't fill it to that level up to the top, which could be mitzaref. It's only sheer lahavsh, sheer litzaref also, but if it's filled right up to the rim, it's filled up to the top, that's also if it's a sheer where it could be mitzaref, even though it's not inevitable, it's still awesome. Because Rav holds like Rav Yehuda. he holds like Rav Yehuda the Dovid Shem is common is also. So you can only put in, even though when you're allowed to put in the water, it's only a shiur lahafsha, but not a shiur l'tzarek. U'Shmuel Amar afilu shiur l'tzarek muter. But Shmuel says no, even filling it up to the top is also muter. That's also muter. And so long as he's not miskaven, so long as that's not his intent, so long as his intent is only to warm the water, to make it not so cold, then it's muter. Even though it might be mitzaref, even though it might harden the metal, and if it hardens the metal, there is tzira if it's makeh b'patish. But Shmuel holds like Rav Shimon. Shmuel holds like Rav Shimon, Dovid Shem is common is muter. So this is not a psik reisha, and it'll be muter. So really, the same machloikis that we have Rav Ada bar Masna, who is holding like Rav Shimon and Abaya like Rav Yehuda, it's a corresponding machloikis between Rav and Shmuel.